Well, good morning, everybody. I want to thank Dr. Sahin for a very interesting and informative paper and a summary thereof. And I would like to respond, really, particularly from a Christian perspective, partly because I'm entirely unqualified to comment on the Islamic theology and history within his paper, but also because I believe there are genuine points of resonance between the two different points of view, and hence the title for the response that I'll give now, which is the need for religious secularism. The second half of the 20th century was dominated by a conflict between two irreconcilably opposed superpowers. Their values were fundamentally different and incompatible, and each was, at least in theory, prepared to be defended to the death. This was the battle between capitalism and communism, between freedom and equality, between the small state and a totalitarian state, and for some at least, between godliness and godlessness. East was east and west was west, and the two could not conceivably meet. Except that rather peculiarly, the US and the USSR were both secular states. That secularism, a term I'll explore a little more in the essay, blurred a little for America in the first decade of the Cold War, when in 1954 Congress passed a bill that added the words "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance, and then again 2 years later when President Eisenhower made "In God We Trust" the national motto. But in spite of such concessions to what was a nervous nation at the time, the fact remains that Article 6 of the US Constitution and the First Amendment stood and stand as distinctive cornerstones of US politics. Indeed, so distinctive are they that, according to a recent study of the relations between state and religion in 175 countries by political scientist Jonathan Fox, he found that at the federal level, the USA is unique among all countries in that it has absolute separation of state and religion. As to the USSR, you don't have to go too far to find its secular roots. Shortly after the revolution, the innocuous-sounding and impeccably secular Decree on the Freedom of Conscience and the State on Church and Religious Associations was passed, separating Orthodox Church from state and appearing to guarantee freedom of both religion and irreligion. The reality was, of course, very different, and the Orthodox Church and others were deprived of their legal personality, and they had lands and properties nationalised, and such crimes as giving religious instruction or inspiring superstition in the masses merited up to a year's corrective labour. The manner in which both the US and the USSR could legitimately lay claim to being secular warns us of the elasticity of the term. Even within the infinitely more measured and careful world of academic reflection, there is considerable disagreement over its precise meaning. Charles Taylor, for example, began his recent magnum opus, A Secular Age, by outlining three distinct modes of understanding the term secular. With an eye to one particular question on the briefing paper for this seminar, what theological grounds are there for the category of secular within contemporary religious thought, I want to argue that the aggressive secularism that was practiced in the USSR and is still preached in some quarters today is by no means the necessary one, and that properly understood, secularism is not only compatible with religious faith, but a legitimate and necessary means of expressing that faith. The word secular is first found in English in the late 13th century and derives from the Latin word seculum, meaning age or generation. It was a concept that found a rich seam in the twin-track Christianity of the Middle Ages, as we shall see. But it is in fact as old as Christianity itself. The early Christians believed that the resurrection of Christ inaugurated a new age. They were New Agers, if you like. It was a time in which God, through his crucified, resurrected and ascended Messiah, had made good on his promises of liberation and redemption, freeing his terminally rebellious creatures from their sin and its effects. Followers of Christ were charged with living under this new regime and telling the world about it, but this caused problems. The gospel, as it came to be known, was politically subversive at the time. Indeed, the word evangelion, the Greek word evangelion means to get gospel, whilst having roots in the Old Testament, was an adaptation of the annunciation of imperial good news. According to Christians, Jesus Christ was the world's Lord, not Caesar. He offered peace and security, an imperial idiom, not Caesar. He ruled by the cross, not Caesar. Christians' citizenship and loyalty lay first and foremost with the risen Christ, not the earthly emperor. And yet Christianity was not politically revolutionary in the sense that we understand the term. Christians were not interested in overthrowing the public authorities, merely of putting them in their place. The authorities still had a role, indeed a critical role to play. Crucially, however, that role did not entail accreting to themselves power and authority that was properly the property of the divine. Christians were mandated to respect the authorities but not to worship them. In the words of one early Christian of the 2nd century, I will pay honour to the emperor not by worshipping him but by praying for him. This resulted, as you might expect, in an ongoing low-level tension between the public authorities and this troublesome but growing sect, tension that occasionally erupted into bouts of grotesque persecution. These lie outside our interest, but the fact is the emergence of Christianity, with its combination of a continued respect for public authorities amidst the proclamation of a new age, a new authority and a new loyalty, that lays the foundation for what we now know as the secular, a public space in which the authorities should be respected but can be legitimately challenged and may never accord themselves absolute or ultimate significance. From these origins you can readily see how the word secular came ultimately in some quarters to stand foursquare against the Christian, indeed the religious. When the word first appeared in the Middle Ages, it was used to mean worldly, or more precisely belonging to this world or age, and it rapidly attached itself to those clergy, secular clergy, who lived with their flock, as opposed to the religious or spiritual clergy who lived away from the distractions of this world within a monastic order. The short step from such usage to the word coming to stand for something that is intentionally non- or anti-religious. This is precisely how it came to be used by Christians and atheists alike in 19th century England, when one of the most prominent anti-religious figures of the Victorian period, George Holyoake, first used the word secularism to mean the doctrine that morality should be based on the well-being of man in the present life, without regard to religious belief or a hereafter. It's by means of this long and winding and diverging stream that we come to the absurdities of both the USSR and the USA, both laying claim to the mantle of secularism, and the reason why in Britain today so many people are so confused about the term. The first step then, I would argue, is to disentangle those two types of secularism. And it was this kind of disentangling that I detected in Dr. Sahin's paper, in his discussion of secularity and secularism. The secular state, in the former sense, is one in which, he says, we can create a sense of solidarity and common purpose, nurturing cultural civility within the multiplicity of values and ways of life. This is something that I think believers should welcome and work towards. The secular state, in the latter sense of secularism, on the other hand, he argues, constitutes a political culture that views the presence of public religion as inherently malignant and cannot foster a genuine culture of dialogue, critical openness and engagement. This, it hardly needs stating, is not something to which religious believers would aspire. It's a rather similar distinction to the one drawn by the Archbishop of Canterbury when he talked about the difference between programmatic secularism and procedural secularism. The former is secularism, as Dr. Sahin termed it, a Soviet-style approach in which religion is generally, even forcibly, privatised for all sorts of reasons. The latter is Dr. Sahin's secularity, in Rowan Williams' words, a crowded and argumentative public square which acknowledges the authority of a legal mediator or broker whose job is to balance and manage real difference. This is secularism as an attempt to deal fairly with all religious and irreligious commitments, US style rather than USSR style secularism. It is in effect a modern, worked through version of the kind of understanding of the secular that emerged in embryonic form in the early Christian centuries. For the sake of continuity and clarity, I'll stick to Dr. Sahin's terms of secularity and secularism for the rest of this paper, but I do think that they could easily be exchanged for procedural and programmatic secularism, and indeed lots of other terms that are used synonymously. And I was pleased to read in Dr. Sahin's analysis of his approval of secularity, not only because it resonates with my own particular convictions, but because I believe that a religious engagement with secularity is positively necessary